to say that this was because I was a good person, but it's not because I'm a good person. It's because I can't tell lies. Mother was a small person who smelt nice, and she sometimes wore a fleece with a zip down the front, which was pink, and it had a tiny label which said Berghaus on the left bosom. A lie is when you say something happened which didn't happen. But there is only ever one thing which happened at a particular time and a particular place, and there are an infinite number of things which didn't happen at that time and at that place. And if I think about something which didn't happen, I start thinking about all the other things which didn't happen. For example, this morning for breakfast, I had ready brek and some hot raspberry milkshake. But if I say that I actually had shreddies and a mug of tea, but I wouldn't have shreddies and tea because they're both brown, I start thinking about Cocoa Pops and lemonade and porridge and Dr. Pepper, and how I wasn't eating my breakfast in Egypt, and there wasn't a rhinoceros in the room, and Father wasn't wearing a diving suit, and so on, and even writing this makes me feel shaky and scared, like I do when I'm standing on the top of a very tall building, and there are thousands of houses and cars and people below me, and my head is so full of all these things that I'm afraid I'm going to forget to stand up straight and hang onto the rail, and I'm going to fall over and be killed. This is another reason why I don't like proper novels, because they're lies about things which didn't happen, and they make me feel shaky and scared. And this is why everything I have written here is true. Chapter 41. There were clouds in the sky on the way home, so I couldn't see the Milky Way. I said, "I'm sorry," because Father had had to come to the police station, which was a bad thing. He said, "It's okay." I said, "I didn't kill the dog." And he said, "Oh, no." Then he said, "Christopher, you have to stay out of trouble, okay?" And I said, "I didn't know I was going to get into trouble. I like Wellington, and I went to say hello to him, but I didn't know that someone had killed him." Father said, "Just try and keep your nose out of other people's business." I thought for a little, and I said, "I'm going to find out who killed Wellington." And Father said, "Were you listening to what I was saying, Christopher?" I said, "Yes, I was listening to what you were saying. But when someone gets murdered, you have to find out who did it so that they can be punished." And he said, "It's a bloody dog, Christopher, a bloody dog." I replied, "I think dogs are important too." He said, "Leave it." And I said, "I wonder if the police will find out who killed him and punish the person." Then Father banged the steering wheel with his fist, and the car weaved a little bit across the dotted line in the middle of the road, and he said, "I said leave it, for God's sake." I could tell that he was angry because he was shouting, and I didn't want to make him angry, so I didn't say anything else until we got home. When we came in through the front door, I went into the kitchen and I got a carrot for Toby, and I went upstairs and I shut the door of my room, and I let Toby out and gave him the carrot. Then I turned my computer on and played 76 games of Minesweeper and did the expert version in 102 seconds, which was only 3 seconds off my best time, which was 99 seconds. At 2:07 a.m., I decided that I wanted a drink of orange squash before I brushed my teeth and got into bed, so I went downstairs to the kitchen. Father was sitting on the sofa, watching snooker on the television and drinking whiskey. There were tears coming out of his eyes. I asked, "Are you sad about Wellington?" He looked at me for a long time and sucked air in through his nose. Then he said, "Yes, Christopher, you could say that. You could very well say that." I decided to leave him alone because when I'm sad I want to be left alone. So I didn't say anything else. I just went into the kitchen and made my orange squash and took it back upstairs to my room. Chapter 43. Mother died 2 years ago. I came home from school one day and no one answered the door, so I went and found the secret key that we keep under a flower pot behind the kitchen door. I let myself into the house and carried on making the Airfix Sherman tank model I was building. An hour and a half later, Father came home from work. He runs a business and he does heating maintenance and boiler repair with a man called Rodri, who's his employee. He knocked on the door of my room and opened it and asked whether I had seen Mother. I said that I hadn't seen her, and he went downstairs and started making some phone calls. I didn't hear what he said. Then he came up to my room and said he had to go out for a while and he wasn't sure how long he'd be. He said that if I needed anything, I should call him on his mobile phone. He was away for 2.5 hours. When he came back, I went downstairs. He was sitting in the kitchen, staring out of the back window, down the garden to the pond and the corrugated iron fence, and the top of the tower of the church on Manstead Street, which looks like a castle because it's Norman. Father said, "I'm afraid you won't be seeing your mother for a while." He didn't look at me when he said this. He kept on looking through the window. Usually, people look at you when they're talking to you. I know that they're working out what I'm thinking, but I can't tell what they're thinking. It's like being in a room with a one-way mirror in a spy film. But this was nice, having Father speak to me but not look at me. I said, "Why not?" He waited for a very long time. Then he said, "Your mother has had to go into hospital." "Can we visit her?" I asked, because I like hospitals. I like the uniforms and the machines. Father said, "No." I said, "Why can't we?" And he said, "She needs rest. She needs to be on her own." I asked, "Is it a psychiatric hospital?" And Father said, "No, it's an ordinary hospital. She has a problem with her heart." I said, "We'll need to take food to her," because I knew that food in hospital was not very good. David from school, he went into hospital to have an operation on his leg to make his calf muscle longer so that he could walk better, and he hated the food, so his mother used to take meals in every day. Father waited a long time again and said, "I'll take some into her during the day when you're at school, and I'll give it to the doctors and they can give it to your mum, okay?" I said, "But you can't cook." Father put his hands over his face and said, "Christopher, look, I'll buy some ready-made stuff from Marks and Spencer's and take those in. She likes those." I said I would make her a get-well card, because that's what you do for people when they're in hospital. Father said he would take it in the next day. Chapter 47. In the bus on the way to school next morning, we passed 4 red cars in a row, which meant that it was a good day, so I decided not to be sad about Wellington. Mr. Jevons, the psychologist at the school, once asked me why 4 red cars in a row made it a good day, and 3 red cars in a row made it a quite good day, and 5 red cars in a row made it a super good day, and why 4 yellow cars in a row made it a black day, which is a day when I don't speak to anyone, and sit on my own reading books, and don't eat my lunch, and take no risks. He said that I was clearly a very logical person, so he was surprised that I should think like this, because it wasn't very logical. I said that I liked things to be in a nice order, and one way of things being in a nice order was to be logical, especially if those things were numbers or an argument. But there were other ways of putting things in a nice order, and that was why I had good days and black days. And I said that some people who worked in an office came out of their house in the morning and saw that the sun was shining and it made them feel happy, or they saw that it was raining and it made them feel sad, but the only difference was the weather. And if they worked in an office, the weather didn't have anything to do with whether they had a good day or a bad day. I said that when Father got up in the morning, he always put his trousers on before he put his socks on. And it wasn't logical, but he always did it that way, because he liked things in a nice order too. And whenever he went upstairs, he went up 2 at a time, always starting with his right foot. Mr. Jevons said that I was a very clever boy. I said that I wasn't clever. I was just noticing how things were, and that wasn't clever. That was just being observant. Being clever was when you looked at how things were and used the evidence to work out something new, like the universe expanding, or who committed a murder. Or if you see someone's name and you give each letter a value from 1 to 26, A equals 1, B equals 2, etc., and you add the numbers up in your head and you find that it makes a prime number, like Jesus Christ, 151, or Scooby-Doo, 113, or Sherlock Holmes, 163, or Dr. Watson, 167. Mr. Jevons asked me whether this made me feel safe, having things always in a nice order, and I said it did. Then he asked me if I didn't like things changing, and I said I wouldn't mind things changing if I became an astronaut, for example, which is one of the biggest changes you can imagine, apart from becoming a girl or dying. He asked whether I wanted to become an astronaut, and I said I did. He said that it was very difficult to become an astronaut. I said that I knew. You had to become an officer in the Air Force, and you had to take lots of orders and be prepared to kill other human beings, and I couldn't take orders. Also, I didn't have 20/20 vision, which you needed to be a pilot. But I said that you could still want something that's very unlikely to happen. Terry, who is the older brother of Francis, who is at the school, said I would only ever get a job collecting supermarket trolleys or cleaning out donkey shit at an animal sanctuary, and they didn't let spazzers drive rockets that cost billions of pounds. When I told this to Father, he said that Terry was jealous of my being cleverer than him, which was a stupid thing to think, because we weren't in a competition. But Terry is stupid, so quod erat demonstrandum, which is Latin for which is the thing that was going to be proved, which means thus it is proved. I'm not a spazzer, which means spastic, not like Francis, who is a spazzer. And even though I probably won't become an astronaut, I am going to go to university and study mathematics, or physics and mathematics, which is a joint honor school, because I like mathematics and physics and I'm very good at them. But Terry won't go to university. Father says Terry is most likely to wind up in prison. Terry has a tattoo on his arm of a heart shape with a knife through the middle of it. But this is what is called a digression, and now I'm going to go back to the fact that it was a good day. Because it was a good day, I decided that I would try and find out who killed Wellington, because a good day is a day for projects and planning things. When I said this to Siobhan, she said, "Well, we're meant to be writing stories today, so why don't you write about finding Wellington and going to the police station?" And that's when I started writing this. And Siobhan said that she'd help with the spelling and the grammar and the footnotes. Chapter 53. Mother died 2 weeks later. I hadn't been into hospital to see her, but Father had taken in lots of food from Marks and Spencer's. He said that she'd been looking okay and seemed to be getting better. She had sent me lots of love and had my get well card on the table beside her bed. Father said that she liked it very much. The card had pictures of cars on the front. I did it with Mrs. Peters at school, who does art, and it was a lino cut, which is when you draw a picture on a piece of lino, and Mrs. Peters cuts round the picture with a Stanley knife, and then you put ink on the lino and press it onto the paper, which is why all the cars looked the same, because I did one car and pressed it onto the paper 9 times. And it was Mrs. Peters' idea to do lots of cars, which I liked, and I coloured all the cars in with red paint to make it a super good day for Mother. Father said that she died of a heart attack, and it wasn't expected. I said, what kind of heart attack? Because I was surprised. Mother was only 38 years old, and heart attacks usually happen to older people, and Mother was very active and rode a bicycle and ate food which was healthy and high in fibre and low in saturated fat, like chicken and vegetables and muesli. Father said that he didn't know what kind of heart attack she had, and now wasn't the moment to be asking questions like that. I said that it was probably an aneurysm. A heart attack is when some of the muscles in the heart stop getting blood and die. There are two main types of heart attack. The first is an embolism. That's when a blood clot blocks one of the blood vessels taking blood to the muscles in the heart. And you can stop this happening by taking aspirin and eating fish, which is why Eskimos don't get this sort of heart attack, because they eat fish and fish stops their blood clotting. But if they cut themselves badly, they can bleed to death. But an aneurysm is when a blood vessel breaks and the blood doesn't get to the heart muscles because it's leaking. And some people get aneurysms just because there's a weak bit in their blood vessels, like Mrs. Hardesty, who lived at number 72 in our street, who had a weak bit in the blood vessels in her neck and died just because she turned her head round to reverse her car into a parking space. On the other hand, it could have been an embolism, because your blood clots much more easily when you're lying down for a long time, like when you're in hospital. Father said, "I'm sorry, Christopher. I'm really sorry." But it wasn't his fault. Then Mrs. Shears came over and cooked supper for us, and she was wearing sandals and jeans and a T-shirt which had the words Windsurf and Corfu and a picture of a windsurfer on it. And Father was sitting down, and she stood next to him and held his head against her bosoms and said, "Come on, Ed, we're going to get you through this." And then she made us spaghetti and tomato sauce. And after dinner she played Scrabble with me, and I beat her 247 points to 134. Chapter 59. I decided that I was going to find out who killed Wellington, even though Father had told me to stay out of other people's business. This is because I don't always do what I'm told. And this is because when people tell you what to do, it's usually confusing and doesn't make sense. For example, people often say, "Be quiet," but they don't tell you how long to be quiet for. Or you see a sign which says, "Keep off the grass," but it should say, "Keep off the grass around this sign," or "Keep off all the grass in this park," because there's lots of grass you are allowed to walk on. Also, people break rules all the time. For example, Father often drives over 30 in a 30-mile-per-hour zone, and sometimes he drives when he's been drinking, and often he doesn't wear his seatbelt when he's driving his van. And in the Bible it says, "Thou shalt not kill," but there were the Crusades, and 2 world wars, and the Gulf War, and there were Christians killing people in all of them. Also, I don't know what Father means when he says, "Stay out of other people's business," because I don't know what he means by other people's business, because I do lots of things with other people, at school and in the shop and on the bus, and his job is going into other people's houses and fixing their boilers and their heating, and all of these things are other people's business. Siobhan understands. When she tells me not to do something, she tells me exactly what it is that I am not allowed to do, and I like this. For example, she once said, "You must never punch Sarah, or hit her in any way, Christopher, even if she hits you first. If she does hit you again, move away from her and stand still and count from 1 to 50. Then come and tell me what she's done, or tell one of the other members of the staff what she's done." Or, for example, she once said, "If you want to go on the swings and there are already people on the swings, you must never push them off. You must ask them if you can have a go, and then you must wait until they have finished." But when other people tell you what you can't do, they don't do it like this. So I decide for myself what I'm going to do and what I'm not going to do. That evening, I went round to Mrs. Shears' house and knocked on the door and waited for her to answer it. When she opened the door, she was holding a mug of tea, and she was wearing sheepskin slippers, and she'd been watching a quiz program on the television, because there was a television on, and I could hear someone saying, "The capital city of Venezuela is A. Maracas, B. Caracas, C. Bogota, or D. Georgetown." And I knew that it was Caracas. She said, "Christopher, I really don't think I want to see you right now." I said, "I didn't kill Wellington." And she replied, "What are you doing here?" I said, wanted to come and tell you that I didn't kill Wellington, and also I want to find out who killed him." Some of her tea spilled onto the carpet. I said, "Do you know who killed Wellington?" She didn't answer my question. She just said, "Goodbye, Christopher," and closed the door. Then I decided to do some detective work. I could see that she was watching me and waiting for me to leave, because I could see her standing in the hall on the other side of the frosted glass in her front door. So I walked down the path and out of the garden. Then I turned round and saw that she wasn't standing in her hall any longer. I made sure that there was no one watching and climbed over the wall and walked down the side of the house into her back garden to the shed where she kept all her gardening tools. The shed was locked with a padlock, and I couldn't go inside, so I walked round to the window in the side. Then I had some good luck. When I looked through the window, I could see a fork that looked exactly the same as the fork that had been sticking out of Wellington. It was lying on the bench by the window, and it had been cleaned because there was no blood on the spikes. I could see some other tools as well, a spade and a rake, and one of those long clippers people use for cutting branches which are too high to reach. And they all had the same green plastic handles, like the fork. This meant that the fork belonged to Mrs. Shears. Either that, or it was a red herring, which is a clue which makes you come to a wrong conclusion, or something which looks like a clue, but isn't. I wondered if Mrs. Shears had killed Wellington herself. But if she had killed Wellington herself, why did she come out of the house shouting, "What in fuck's name have you done to my dog?" I thought that Mrs. Shears probably didn't kill Wellington, but whoever had killed him had probably killed him with Mrs. Shears' fork. And the shed was locked. This meant that it was someone who had the key to Mrs. Shears' shed, or that she had left it unlocked, or that she had left her fork lying around in the garden. I heard a noise and turned round and saw Mrs. Shears standing on the lawn looking at me. I said, "I came to see if the fork was in the shed." And she said, "If you don't go now, I'll call the police again." So I went home. When I got home, I said hello to Father and went upstairs to feed Toby, my rat, and felt happy because I was being a detective and finding things out. Chapter 61. Mrs. Forbes at school said that when Mother died, she had gone to heaven. That was because Mrs. Forbes is very old and she believes in heaven. And she wears tracksuit trousers because she says they're more comfortable than normal trousers. And one of her legs is very slightly shorter than the other one because of an accident on a motorbike. But when Mother died, she didn't go to heaven because heaven doesn't exist. Mrs. Peters' husband is a vicar called the Reverend Peters, and he comes to our school sometime to talk to us, and I asked him where heaven was, and he said, "It's not in our universe, it's another kind of place altogether." The Reverend Peters makes a funny ticking noise with his tongue sometimes when he's thinking, and he smokes cigarettes, and you can smell them on his breath, and I don't like this. I said that there wasn't anything outside the universe, and there wasn't another kind of place altogether. Except that there might be if you went through a black hole. But a black hole is what is called a singularity, which means it's impossible to find out what's on the other side, because the gravity of a black hole is so big that even electromagnetic waves, like light, can't get out of it, and electromagnetic waves are how we get information about things which are far away. And if heaven was on the other side of a black hole, dead people would have to be fired into space on rockets to get there, and they aren't, or people would notice. I think people believe in heaven because they don't like to think of the idea of dying, because they want to carry on living, and they don't like the idea that other people will move into their house and put their things into the rubbish. The Reverend Peters said, "Well, when I say that heaven is outside the universe, it's really just a manner of speaking. I suppose what it really means is that they're with God." And I replied, "But where is God?" And the Reverend Peters said that we should talk about this on another day when he had more time. What actually happens when you die is that your brain stops working and your body rots, like Rabbit did when he died and we buried him in the earth at the bottom of the garden. And all his molecules were broken down into other molecules, and they went into the earth and were eaten by worms and went into the plants. And if we go and dig in the same place in 10 years, there'll be nothing except his skeleton left. And in 1,000 years, even his skeleton will be gone. But that's all right, because he's a part of the flowers and the apple tree and the hawthorn bush now. When people die, they're sometimes put into coffins, which means that they don't mix with the earth for a very long time, until the wood of the coffin rots. But Mother was cremated. This means that she was put into a coffin and burnt and ground up and turned into ash and smoke. I don't know what happens to the ash, and I couldn't ask at the crematorium because I didn't go to the funeral. But the smoke goes out of the chimney and into the air, and sometimes I look up into the sky and I think that there are molecules of Mother up there, or in the clouds over Africa, or the Antarctic, or coming down as rain in the rainforests in Brazil, or in snow somewhere. Chapter 67. The next day was Saturday, and there's not much to do on a Saturday unless Father takes me out somewhere on an outing, to the boating lake or to the garden centre. But on this Saturday, England were playing Romania at football, which meant that we weren't going to go on an outing because Father wanted to watch the match on the television. So I decided to do some more detection on my own. I decided that I would go and ask some of the other people who lived in our street if they had seen anyone killing Wellington, or whether they had seen anything strange happening in the street on Thursday night. Talking to strangers is not something I usually do. I don't like talking to strangers. This is not because of stranger danger, which they tell us about at school, which is where a strange man offers you sweets or a ride in his car because he wants to do sex with you. I'm not worried about that. If a strange man touched me, I'd hit him, and I can hit people very hard. For example, when I punched Sarah because she had pulled my hair, I knocked her unconscious, and she had a concussion, and they had to take her to the accident and emergency department at the hospital. And also, I always have my Swiss Army knife in my pocket, and it has a saw blade which could cut a man's fingers off. I don't like strangers because I don't like people I've never met before. They're hard to understand. It's like being in France, which is where we went on holiday sometimes when Mother was alive, to camp. And I hated it, because if you went into a shop or a restaurant or on a beach, you couldn't understand what anyone was saying, which was frightening. It takes me a long time to get used to people I don't know. For example, when there's a new member of staff at school, I don't talk to them for weeks and weeks. I just watch them until I know that they're safe. Then I ask them questions about themselves, like whether they have pets, and what's their favorite color, and what do they know about the Apollo space missions, and I get them to draw a plan of their house, and I ask them what kind of car they drive, so I get to know them. Then I don't mind if I'm in the same room as them, and I don't have to watch them all the time. So talking to the other people in our street was brave, but if you're going to do detective work, you have to be brave, so I had no choice. First of all, I made a plan of our part of the street, which is called Randolph Street. Then I made sure I had my Swiss Army knife in my pocket, and I went out and knocked on the door of number 40, which is opposite Mrs. Shear's house, which means that they were most likely to have seen something. The people who live at number 40 are called Thompson. Mr. Thompson answered the door. He was wearing a T-shirt which said, "Beer, helping ugly people have sex for 2,000 years." Mr. Thompson said, "Can I help you?" I said, "Do you know who killed Wellington?" I didn't look at his face. I don't like looking at people's faces, especially if they're strangers. And he didn't say anything for a few seconds. Then he said, "Who are you?" I said, "I'm Christopher Boone from number 36, and I know you. You're Mr. Thompson." He said, "Oh, Mr. Thompson's brother." I said, "Do you know who killed Wellington?" He said, "Who the fuck is Wellington?" I said, "Mrs. Shears's dog. Mrs. Shears is from number 41. He said, "Someone killed her dog?" I said, "With a fork." He said, "Jesus Christ." I said, "A garden fork," in case he thought I meant a fork you eat your food with. Then I said, "Do you know who killed him?" He said, "I haven't a bloody clue." I said, "Did you see anything suspicious on Thursday evening?" He said, "Look, son, do you really think you should be going round asking questions like this?" And I said, "Yes, because I want to find out who killed Wellington, and I'm writing a book about it." And he said, "Well, I was in Colchester on Thursday, so you're asking the wrong bloke." I said, "Thank you," and I walked away. There was no answer at house number 42. I had seen the people who lived at house number 44, but I didn't know what their names were. They were black people, and they were a man and a lady with 2 children, a boy and a girl. The lady answered the door. She was wearing boots which looked like army boots, and there were 5 bracelets made out of a silver-coloured metal on her wrist, and they made a jangling noise. She said, "It's Christopher, isn't it?" I said that it was, and I asked her if she knew who killed Wellington. She knew who Wellington was, so I didn't have to explain, and she had heard about him being killed. I asked if she had seen anything suspicious on Thursday evening, which might be a clue. She said, "Like what?" And I said, "Like strangers, or like the sound of people arguing." But she said she hadn't. And then I decided to do what is called trying a different tack, and I asked her whether she knew of anyone who might want to make Mrs. Shears sad. And she said, "Perhaps you should be talking to your father about this." And I explained that I couldn't ask my father because the investigation was a secret, because he had told me to stay out of other people's business. She said, "Well, maybe he has a point, Christopher." And I said, "So you don't know anything which might be a clue?" And she said, "No." And then she said, "You be careful, young man." I said that I would be careful, and then I said thank you to her for helping me with my questions, and I went to number 43, which is the house next to Mrs. Shears's house. The people who live at number 43 are Mr. Wise and Mr. Wise's mother, who's in a wheelchair, which is why he lives with her, so he can take her to the shops and drive her around. It was Mr. Wise who answered the door. He smelt of body odour and old biscuits and off popcorn, which is what you smell of if you haven't washed for a very long time, like Jason at school smells, because his family's poor. I asked Mr. Wise if he knew who had killed Wellington on Thursday night. He said, "Bloody hell, policemen really are getting younger, aren't they?" Then he laughed. I don't like people laughing at me, so I turned and walked away. I didn't knock at the door of number 38, which is the house next to our house, because the people there take drugs, and Father says that I should never talk to them, so I don't. And they play loud music at night, and they make me scared sometimes when I see them in the street, and it's not really their house. Then I noticed that the old lady who lives at number 39, which is on the other side of Mrs. Shears's house, was in her front garden, cutting her hedge with an electric hedge trimmer. Her name is Mrs. Alexander. She has a dog. It's a dachshund, so she was probably a good person because she liked dogs. But the dog wasn't in the garden with her. It was inside the house. Mrs. Alexander was wearing jeans and training shoes, which old people don't normally wear, and there was mud on the jeans, and the trainers were New Balance trainers, and the laces were red. I went up to Mrs. Alexander and said, "Do you know anything about Wellington being killed?" Then she turned off the electric hedge trimmer and said, "I'm afraid you're going to have to say that again. I'm a little deaf." So I said, "Do you know anything about Wellington being killed?" And she said, "I heard about it yesterday. Dreadful, dreadful." I said, "Do you know who killed him?" And she said, "No, I don't." I replied, "Somebody must know, because the person who killed Wellington knows that they killed Wellington, unless they were a mad person and didn't know what they were doing, or unless they had amnesia." And she said, "Well, I suppose you're probably right." I said, "Thank you for helping me with my investigation." And she said, "You're Christopher, aren't you?" I said, "Yes, I live at number 36. And she said, "We haven't talked before, have we?" I said, "No, I don't like talking to strangers, but I'm doing detective work." And she said, "I see you every day going to school." I didn't reply to this. And she said, "It's very nice of you to come and say hello." I didn't reply to this either, because Mrs. Alexander was doing what is called chatting, where people say things to each other which aren't questions and answers, and aren't connected. Then she said, "Even if it's only because you're doing detective work." And I said, "Thank you," again. And I was about to turn and walk away when she said, "I have a grandson your age." I tried to do chatting by saying, "My age is 15 years and 3 months and 3 days." And she said, "Well, almost your age." Then we said nothing for a little while, until she said, "You don't have a dog, do you?" And I said, "No." And she said, "You'd probably like a dog, wouldn't you?" And I said, "I have a rat." And she said, "A rat?" And I said, "He's called Toby." And she said, "Oh." And I said, "Most people don't like rats because they think they carry diseases like bubonic plague. But that's only because they live in sewers and stowed away on ships coming from foreign countries where there were strange diseases. But rats are very clean. Toby is always washing himself. And you don't have to take him out for walks. I just let him run around my room so he gets some exercise. And sometimes he sits on my shoulder or hides in my sleeve like it's a burrow, but rats don't live in burrows in nature." Mrs. Alexander said, "Do you want to come in for tea?" And I said, "I don't go into other people's houses." And she said, "Well, maybe I could bring some out here. Do you like lemon squash?" I replied, "I only like orange squash." And she said, "Luckily I have some of that as well. And what about Battenberg?" And I said, "I don't know, because I don't know what Battenberg is." She said, "It's a kind of cake. It has 4 pink and yellow squares in the middle, and it has marzipan icing round the edge." And I said, "Is it a long cake with a square cross-section which is divided into equally sized, alternately coloured squares?" And she said, "Yes, I think you could probably describe it like that." And I said, "I think I'd like the pink squares, but not the yellow squares because I don't like yellow. And I don't know what marzipan is, so I don't know whether I'd like that." And she said, "I'm afraid marzipan is yellow too. Perhaps I should bring out some biscuits instead. Do you like biscuits?" And I said, "Yes, some sorts of biscuits." And she said, "I'll get a selection." Then she turned and went into the house. She moved very slowly because she was an old lady, and she was inside the house for more than 6 minutes, and I began to get nervous because I didn't know what she was doing in the house. I didn't know her well enough to know whether she was telling the truth about getting orange squash and Battenberg cake, and I thought she might be ringing the police, and then I'd get into much more serious trouble because of the caution. So I walked away. And as I was crossing the street, I had a stroke of inspiration about who might have killed Wellington. I was imagining a chain of reasoning inside my head, which was like this. 1. Why would you kill a dog? A. Because you hated the dog. B. Because you were mad. C. Because you wanted to make Mrs. Shears upset. 2. I didn't know anyone who hated Wellington, so if it was A, it was probably a stranger. 3. I didn't know any mad people, so if it was B, it was also probably a stranger. 4. Most murders are committed by someone who is known to the victim. In fact, you're most likely to be murdered by a member of your own family on Christmas Day. This is a fact. Wellington was therefore most likely to have been killed by someone known to him. 5. If it was C, I only knew one person who didn't like Mrs. Shears, and that was Mr. Shears, who knew Wellington very well indeed. This meant that Mr. Shears was my prime suspect. Mr. Shears used to be married to Mrs. Shears, and they lived together until 2 years ago. Then Mr. Shears left and didn't come back. This was why Mrs. Shears came over and did lots of cooking for us after Mother died, because she didn't have to cook for Mr. Shears anymore, and she didn't have to stay at home and be his wife. And also, Father said that she needed company and didn't want to be on her own. And sometimes Mrs. Shears stayed overnight at our house, and I liked it when she did, because she made things tidy, and she arranged the jars and pans and tins in order of their height on the shelves in the kitchen, and she always made their labels face outwards, and she put the knives and forks and spoons in the correct compartments in the cutlery drawer. But she smoked cigarettes, and she said lots of things I didn't understand. For example, I'm going to hit the hay, and it's brass monkeys out there, and let's rustle up some tucker. And I didn't like it when she said things like that, because I didn't know what she meant. And I don't know why Mr. Shears left Mrs. Shears, because nobody told me. But when you get married, it's because you want to live together and have children. And if you get married in a church, you have to promise that you'll stay together until death do us part. And if you don't want to live together, you have to get divorced. And this is because one of you has done sex with somebody else, or because you're having arguments and you hate each other and you don't want to live in the same house anymore and have children. And Mr. Shears didn't want to live in the same house as Mrs. Shears anymore, so he probably hated her, and he might have come back and killed her dog to make her sad. I decided to try and find out more about Mr. Shears.